the new session of the plenary discussion on market stability. So today we'll be joined by Dr. Vincent Carret. He is a visiting assistant professor of economics at Creighton University and a faculty fellow at Menard Family Institute for the Economic Inquiry. He received his PhD from the University of Lyon and previously worked as visiting scholar, archivist at Duke University. His research focuses on historical political economy, on the ideas, interests, and institutions that have shaped market economies. He co-authored the book Economic Instability, New Perspectives on the History of Macroeconomics. He will be discussing that with us today. So thank you, Vincent. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me. I'm going to share my slideshow. Okay. All right. Well, I'm really happy to be here and to talk about this question of are markets stable? So this is the theme for this week, and I thought it was a very, very interesting question. This is, a question which I studied during my dissertation, and during my dissertation, I wrote on this idea of economic instability and how it was modeled in the 1930s by a number of economists. And this led to the publication of a book with my advisor and co-author, Michael Assus. And really, the idea is to explore how economists came to answer this question and what were the implications of asking these questions. And also, like, what do they mean by it? And in this lecture, I'd like to try to go back on how economists answer this question and how this question then moved from the models of economists in the 1930s to the idea of stabilization policies, and what is the connection, if any, between the way in which they conceived of stability and the way in which stabilization policies were then adopted. So the book is mostly concerned with macroeconomic instability and the way that economists modeled it. And then, because it was published 2 years ago, I continued working on kind of what happens after it, on the economic policies, especially in the 1950s. So these are some projects which are ongoing with new co-authors. All right. Well, one way to start exploring this is to look at who received the first Nobel Prize in economics, the 1969 Nobel Prize. And it went to two European economists. It went to Ragnar Frisch and Jan Tinbergen. And the prize motivation was for having developed and applied dynamic models for the analysis of economic processes. And most of this work, they did this work in the 1930s, and Tinbergen and Frisch are really two very central characters of our book, and of this story of how macroeconomics came to be what it is today through the use of models and through the examination of this question of stability, which is really foundational in many ways for macroeconomics. So we need to understand, to answer this question and the way they answered it, we need to understand what is the analysis of economic processes for them. And to understand that, we have to place ourselves back in the 1920s, in the early 20th century, when economists are trying to understand the business cycle and trying to understand why is it that economic fluctuations keep recurring. One of the economists that tries to understand this is Warren Parsons at Harvard. And Parsons is invited to come to Harvard in the late 1910s. He creates this review of economics, the review of economic statistics, and the goal of Parsons is to try to collect a lot of statistics about the economy, and one of his main contributions while he's at Harvard is to create the Harvard Barometer, which is supposed to be able to forecast the future economic weather by looking at different aggregates of different curves, and some curves are leading others. And when the curves leading all the others is going to, turn down, this is going to lead to a downturn in the whole economy, or other curves at least. This idea, this is the Harvard barometer that he builds. This idea is partly inspired by the work of Wesley Clare Mitchell, who's one of the main empiricist economists at this time, who publishes his book on business cycle in the 1913, and all this work is very much empirical, and it kind of collapses. At least the barometer collapses in 1929, because it's not really able to predict the crisis, or even to the extent that it predicts a downturn in economic activity. The people interpreting the barometer refuse to believe this idea that we're going to have a downturn, and so they're kind of discredited after this. So this is kind of the landscape before the 1930s of inquiries into business cycles, and Mitchell is one of the first ones to try to go a little bit beyond this, beyond the pure empirical explanations. Another economist that tries to go beyond a purely empirical exploration of business cycles is Clark. So it's not John Bates Clark, it's his son, John Morris Clark. And Clark proposes the idea of what became known as the accelerator. So the idea is that there is a relationship between changes in consumption and changes in investment. When consumption is increasing, investment, there's going to be more investment, etc. So this is one of the first mechanisms that's identified to try to explain the downturn in the business cycle. And this is kind of where our economists, the macro dynamists, as we call them in the book, like so Ragnar Frisch, Jan Tinbergen, this is really the starting point. The idea that we have some mechanisms, and we need to understand, like, are they enough to explain the cycle? Is the accelerator sufficient to explain cycles? And Frisch really gets his start with this question. He has this debate with Alvin Hansen in the 1930s. So Frisch is Norwegian, but in the early 1930s, he's visiting the United States. And one day he's talking with Alvin Hansen, who's also a business cycle economist. And he explained that they're discussing the nature of the interrelation between capital production and consumer taking. So really this accelerator relationship. And this prompts him to write a paper. And his paper is meant to show that if you put Clark's idea, if you put this idea of the accelerator in a set of equations, well, it shows that it doesn't work. It's not enough to explain the cycle. So this is what he explained in his paper, that in the reduced form of the relationship, we have two variables, but only one equation. It would be attempting the logically impossible if, from the conditions here considered, we should try to demonstrate that the system must, after a while, turn into a depression. So he's saying, okay, you have this idea. Most of this is verbal reasoning, and I want to use mathematical logic, mathematical reasoning, to make sure that your inferences that you draw, that this relationship is enough to explain downturn in the business cycle. I want to check that logically it really makes sense once you use mathematical logic. And he said it doesn't make sense. You need something else. So he's going to propose this something else. He's going to propose to a fully fledged model to close the system and to be able to show some fluctuations in the economy. So in his 1933 model, which is often referred to as the rocking horse model, he adds a relationship to the accelerator relationship. The main relationship he adds is a stabilizing effect of the money supply on the system. And this leads him to build a model which can exhibit both growth and cycles. And this was really his idea, to have both a secular trend and some cycles that would oscillate around the way to a long-run equilibrium. So we talk more about this in the book, and I don't want to enter too much into the economics, because I'm going to explain what was really important for these early econometricians, these early macro dynamic theorists, was really to spell out dynamic processes. Then you know, the economic ideas evolved and were replaced by, you know, things that are more familiar today. But at this point, what's important is to understand that the macro dynamics like Frisch or Tinbergen, they really want to build these models that are dynamic, and because they think that we can talk about stability in a system, in the economy, without spelling out a dynamic process. So the point of this system was to show Clark that this accelerator relationship, it was not sufficient to create cycles. And the model is also famous for introducing the idea that there is both a propagation mechanism, that this propagation mechanism is stable, and that it keeps oscillating because it keeps being hit by shocks or impulses. So he has an analogy in the paper with a pendulum. So a pendulum, if you move it out of its equilibrium position, it's going to fluctuate for a little bit. And then eventually, because there is friction in, you know, the air, it's gonna lead back to equilibrium. And if you want to revive the fluctuations, you need to hit the pendulum again. This is exactly the same idea in the economy. And the other analogy it takes is with a rocking horse. It says the rocking horse is rocking back and forth until it gets to a position of rest, unless you keep hitting it with a club. And then it will keep oscillating and oscillating again. So this idea, they're very much linked to the beginning of the econometric society. This is why I've referred to Frisch or Tinbergen as econometricians, and this is because they're really like some of the most important figures in the creation of the econometric society. And I think it's important to understand that in the 1930s, the econometrics had a slightly different meaning than what we give it today. So when it's founded, econometrics is initially set up for the advancement of economic theory in its relation to statistics and mathematics. And an important part of this work of advancing economic theory is the work of those economists who are interested into macro dynamic processes. So how can we talk about the business cycle? And they spread their ideas. They have a series of meetings in the 1930s. Especially important are the European meetings where Frisch, Tinbergen, and other economists meet and discuss these ideas, discuss their models of the economy, and how they could talk about, you know, the stability of equilibrium in the framework of their models. There were also US-based meetings, but they were less important for those discussions until the 1940s. So during these meetings, Frisch, you know, proposes his ideas on the business cycle. One of the first to take up this idea of macrodynamic is the Polish economist Michał Kalecki. And, you know, Frisch had a very specific view of stability. He was saying the economy is stable. The only reason it keeps fluctuating is that we continue having shocks. But you can consider that for Frisch, markets are stable because they're going to lead us to equilibrium. There are like some feedback processes in the economy that ensure that we go back to equilibrium. Kalecki has a very different view. Kalecki explains that for him, because of the contradictions of the capitalist economy and because of the way that profits behave, waves of prosperity are going to follow, be followed by recessions and depressions, and by recoveries and more prosperity. But in Kalecki's view, the business cycle keeps fluctuating over and over again. It's not stable. It's not going back to an equilibrium, but it's also not completely unstable. It's not exploding away. So the Kalecki's model is very much on the edge of stability and instability. It's a Marxist perspective where markets fluctuate endlessly because of their contradictions. The third important economist in the development of this macro dynamic view is Jan Tinbergen. Tinbergen is a Dutch economist and is very original in the way he approaches these things. That's an idea that we try to defend in the book. And he starts off by examining commodity markets or durable good markets like the shipbuilding cycle. And when he examines commodity markets, he proposes that there are several kinds of stability. You can have stable markets and stable ones or some limit cycles. And in the 1930s, there is a number of other economists who are discussing these processes in the context of single markets. And this leads eventually to the idea of the cobweb model, which really is developed at this time. And from this idea, in the context of the 1930s, of a crisis that starts being, a depression and being very long-lasting, Tinbergen becomes interested in transposing this dynamic process from simple markets to the macroeconomy. And when he does that, he proposes a very different view from Frisch and Kalecki. Is the idea that it's possible to have a model that's going to completely collapse. And the way he models it in the mid-1930s is to propose a very simple model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, but where instead of having one equilibrium, you have two equilibria. And the first one is going to be a stable equilibria, the one around 100. And if fluctuations around this equilibrium are pretty mild, they're going to be stable around this equilibrium. But if there is a shock that's too important, too high, this is going to take the economy into larger and larger fluctuations. And if these fluctuations are too large, it's possible that the economy goes over the second equilibrium, the lowest one at 66 and 2/3. And here, this equilibrium is unstable, meaning that once you go over it, you're going to go all the way down to zero. So there is this very striking idea of collapse in Tinbergen, that he uses nonlinear models to produce a very local stability, but that is coupled with a global instability. And of course, for him, this justifies that we need government policies to dampen not only the fluctuations of the cycles, but also to dampen the size of the shocks to avoid going overboard over an unstable equilibrium. This idea, Tinbergen took it from a famous economist called Irving Fisher. And Fisher wrote this article in 1933. He discusses it with the econometricians, and he proposes the idea that there may be an equilibrium which, though stable, is so delicately poised that after departure from it beyond certain limits, instability ensues, just as at first a stick may bend under strain, ready all the time to bend back until a certain point is reached when it breaks. And this is really the idea that Tinbergen wants to encapsulate in his dynamic model of the economy. Is that you can have some mild fluctuation around the equilibrium, but if you go too far away, well, this is going to break and completely collapse. And Fisher has also another metaphor, which is that such a disaster is somewhat like the capsizing of a ship, which under ordinary conditions is always near stable equilibrium, but which after being tipped beyond a certain angle has no longer this tendency to return to equilibrium, but instead a tendency to depart further from it. So it's really this idea of stability that Tinbergen wants to encapsulate. So, if we summarize at this point, we have really different views of economic instability. So Frisch says the economy is stable, but we're going to have external shocks. Kalecki says, well, we're going to have recurring cycles, and so markets are really not stable. And Tinbergen says, it's possible that markets are stable if they are not pushed too far away from their equilibrium, but then it's possible that if you go too far away, well, the economy is going to be completely unstable. Now, the important point in all these ideas is that what is defended by these people is the importance of examining a dynamic mechanism to talk about the stability or the lack of stability of an equilibrium point. This is really the idea they want to introduce against the empirical economists and against the more literary economists who talk about stability in different ways. The main ways that stability is mentioned in the 1920s is with reference to price stability. And they don't have, economists refer to it, don't have fully fledged models. And the macro dynamists really want to say, look, you can't talk about stability if you talk about the process. Equilibrium is stable or unstable if you haven't explained like what is the process of reaching it. And this is really something they're going to defend throughout the rest of the 1930s. So in 1936, there is a meeting of the Econometric Society in Oxford. And before the meeting, Jan Tinbergen reads a paper by James Mead. James Mead was a British economist who's still young, but became quite famous later. And he reads this paper, and his paper is about stability of equilibrium, but it's in a completely static system. And so Tinbergen is not happy. Tinbergen writes a letter to Mead just before the meeting and says, you know, as far as I can see, your statement on the stability of the system is open to doubt. In general, I deny that it is possible to determine whether a system is stable or not with the help of merely static equations. And then during the meeting, the same thing happens. So Frisch is there, Mead is presenting his paper, and Frisch tells him, you know, the stability of equilibrium cannot be examined without bringing in dynamic considerations. And this is what Frisch had told Clark basically a few years ago during the debate, that you have this idea of an accelerator, but you need to spell out the dynamic process to make sure that it is you can say anything about are we going to reach the equilibrium or not? Is it going to fluctuate? This repeats again when Roy Harrod, who's another British economist, publishes his book on the trade cycle, where he wants to explain the trade cycle by the interaction between the accelerator idea and the idea of the multiplier. And Tinbergen reviews his book, and he said, you know, look, I put your whole book in my equations, and it doesn't work as well. It's peculiar to the movements represented by the last equation that they can never be wave-like. I think it is useful to highlight this here, because reading the book, one might get the impression that the author has the opposite opinion. So they keep hammering it, really, that we need to spell out dynamic processes. Otherwise, it's impossible to say anything about, you know, fluctuation, stability, etc. Now, at this point, it's interesting to think about, you know, this definition of stability that they introduce, because they really redefine it in the framework of equilibrium models and dynamic models, where it's important to reach the equilibrium. If you're a macrodynamist, you want to reach this equilibrium. If you're not at equilibrium, well, you're collapsing, like Tinbergen. So for them, stability is a very desirable property of their models. Like, we want stability. On the other hand, there is a number of other economists who think that maybe stability is not such a good thing, that markets shouldn't be stable. And this is, of course, the field defended by Schumpeter, who think that crises are not simply events which we might attempt to suppress, but perhaps undesirable forms of something which has to be done, namely adjustment to previous economic change. We need the economy to be able to adjust to economic change. And if you have too much stability, this can be dangerous. So this is published in a book called The Economics of the Recovery Program, which is interested in, you know, how do we solve the Great Depression. And it's a bunch of Harvard economists who write this book. And this book in many ways represents this view that maybe we don't need to like completely dampen the cycle if we really want to revive the economy. Now, 15, 16, 17 years later, this book is completely lampooned by Paul Samuelson, who says that after the publication of this book, the young economists deserted Schumpeter, mainly because he was such a bad depression macroeconomist. At the prime age of 51, in a ludicrous book by several Harvard senior professors, Schumpeter praised the Great Depression as a healthy catharsis of the economic system. Now, Samuelson says that, 17 years later, but it's worth noting that at the time, a lot of economists thought this way, and even Samuelson's mentor at Harvard, who's Alvin Hansen. Alvin Hansen had a pretty close view to what Schumpeter said. So in the mid-1930s, there is this 100% money plan that is proposed by some economists, including Chicago. And the idea of these economists is that we need to constrain the expansion of the money supply to stabilize the economy. And Hansen is very much against this. Hansen says, even though it was demonstrated that an inflexible credit supply would stamp out every boom, it does not follow that stability of economic life would thereby be achieved. For it may well be that modern capitalism, as a system of free enterprise, could not survive unless it were permitted to launch forth periodically in just that kind of expensive activity which characterizes the usual boom. So Hansen still believes that in 1936 that we need to have fluctuations so that the system of free enterprise can survive and adapt itself to changing economic conditions. But Hansen changed his views. Hansen became the American Keynes. And the reason for which Hansen changed his views is the 1937 recession. So often when we think about the 1930s, we think about the Great Depression, so 29 to 33, and then we kind of erase the rest of the decade until 39 is the war and the economy starts again. But at the time, the economy was picking up after 1933. This is an index of industrial production. And then what happens in 1937 is that industrial production completely collapses. In a few months, it loses 25%. And economists are really perplexed by what's happening because the economy is nowhere near full employment. There's still 10 to 15% of unemployed. The index of industrial production is barely above its 1929 level. And yet we have this huge downturn and this huge recession that really shocks a lot of economists. And one of the main explanations that's proposed at the time is to look at the public expenditures and to see that net expenditures, they drop abruptly between 36 and 37. What happens is that the first New Deal kind of ends, and Roosevelt and his team decide to balance the budget. So the budget becomes balanced in 1937, and net expenditures go. So government expenditures were running a huge deficit since 1933, and then suddenly we're back at a balanced budget. And so a lot of economists are going to say this is where the problem comes from. And then the problem is going to be to put that in a model that's based on the idea of the econometricians. So this model is going to be Samuelson's accelerator multiplier model. And this model is initially proposed by Alvin Hansen. So Hansen joined Harvard in 1937, and there he sets up this fiscal policy seminar. And in the fiscal policy seminar, they're discussing current conditions and the impact of fiscal policy on the economy, and they're discussing the 1937 recession. And when the recession happens, Hansen says that it's clear that pump priming has not worked in the manner planned and hoped for. Pump priming was to taper off gradually, and private investment was to take hold with increasing vigor, carrying the economy forward to full recovery. So there was this idea that if we want to go back to expansion, the government just needs to have an initial program of expenditures, then it can balance the budget, and private investment is going to take over because markets are stable and they're going to take us back to full employment. Hansen says this view of pump priming, this does not work. This is like taking back the public expenditures after such a huge deficit was a mistake. And to try to explain why, he builds this accelerator multiplier model, which is made up of this, first the accelerator relationship relating investment and with changes in consumption, and the multiplier, which is the idea that an initial impulse of expenditure is going to have cumulative effect as it spreads throughout the economy. And Hansen proposes in his seminar, he offers a numerical example of the way in which the accelerator and the multiplier are going to interact, but he really doesn't work it fully out. And the person that's going to work it out is Paul Samuelson. So Paul Samuelson, he just moved as an undergrad from Chicago to Harvard. And at Harvard, he joins the fiscal policy seminars and he assists to Hansen's presentation of the accelerator multiplier model. And Samuelson is this bright young man, is very technically qualified. He understands the idea of Tinbergen, Frisch, etc. And what he wants to do is to examine in a dynamic mathematical models of the type used by Tinbergen and Frisch and Kalecki. He wants to examine this relationship between accelerator and multiplier. So this is the model is going to set up, like the simplest model you can imagine. There is national income is equal to government expenditures plus consumption plus investment. Then there is the multiplier relationship, which relates consumption with a fixed proportion of income during the past period. And then there is the accelerator relationship relating investment with changes in consumption. And you have these two parameters, alpha for the propensity to consume and beta for the accelerator relation. And if you reduce this model to one equation, you get one equation for national income, and it's national income in period T is dependent on the lags for the two previous periods. And Samuelson knows, based on the work of Tinbergen and others on difference and differential equations, that this is going to be enough to show fluctuations. So Samuelson wants to explore, given the parameters alpha and beta, when is my model going to be stable? When is it going to be unstable? So he has this graph in his paper dividing the plane of parameters between four regions. Region A and B are stable, C and D are unstable, and region B and C are cycles, and A and D are monotonous expansions or exponential going back to equilibrium. And then there is the line between the stable and unstable region, where the economy is in the Kalecki situation, where it's neither unstable nor stable, and it's just fluctuating endlessly. And what Samuelson says is that Hansen, quite by chance, had picked numerical values for the marginal propensity to consume and the relation, which were on the razor's edge that yielded perpetual oscillations with no damping and no exploding. But Samuelson shows that actually this is a very particular case, and the more general case is going to be one where the economy is stable or unstable. But Samuelson is interested in the case where the economy is stable. Later on, he blamed Frisch for stability dogma that had taken hold of him, and he said that I was in this dogma. I thought the world was stable, and this is why he's interested in region A and B mostly. Something else he does in his paper that's not often remarked is that he examines different types of economic policies, different types of behavior for G, and he examines in particular two possible behavior. One is just one impulse of G, and then G gets back to its initial level, or a continuous increase in G, a perpetual increase at a higher level of G. And this is what he wants. This is what he really wants to show, because this is what he wants to use to interpret the 1937 recession. He says, if you just have an impulse in G, and the model is stable, it's going to fluctuate for a while, but then it's going to settle back to its old equilibrium. The only way you can get a higher equilibrium, a higher national income, is by having a perpetually higher level of public expenditures. And that's really the goal of his early papers in this era. And it's very much a model that's against pump priming, that against the idea that once you have this initial public expenditure, markets are going to take the relay, and the economy is going to recover. He's saying, no, this isn't enough. And the reason for this is that the acceleration principle, it can determine the nature of the oscillations, but not the average level of the system. This is determined by G, by the level of G, and by the propensity to consume. So the previous econometricians had very diverse view of stability. Samuelson kind of narrows it down, and he says, even if the world is stable, this might not be enough. We might need to have like continuous expenditures to ensure that we at a high enough level of production so that we're at full employment. Now, Hansen immediately adopts this view of the world that comes from Samuelson's model. Hansen believes, and he starts talking about this from 1938, Hansen believes that the economy is in a secular stagnation. That is that there is not enough investment opportunities for private businesses. And this means that if you believe there is a secular stagnation, as soon as governmental expenditures are withdrawn, the income again will fall back to its previous level. And this is what he explained in his book, in his 1931 book. And this is really the view that even if markets are stable, they will be unable to bring us to the full employment equilibrium. Even if we have this dynamic process that shows us it's going to be stable, this is still not enough. So this is the point where I want to try to go from the models, the way they develop these models, and the way in which these models transferred into the world, into the idea of stabilization policies. And I think that this moment of 1937 and the construction of the accelerator multiplier model along the lines that were advocated by the macrodynamists, this is really like the stepping stone from the idea of stability to the idea of stabilization policies. And so Hansen publishes a number of books, including this Fiscal Policy and Business Cycles in 1941, where he explains that now there is emerging a new aim of fiscal policy, vigorously assailed by some, staunchly defended by others, the aim of ensuring the full employment of the factors of production. And this is an idea that really gets traction in Washington. So the Vice President Henry Wallace publishes this book, 60 Million Jobs, where he explained that during the Depression there was a gap between full employment and employment, and this is why we need compensatory spending to be able to maintain the economy at this higher level of employment. So this is really the same idea as that embodied in the accelerator multiplier model. So this leads to stabilization policies, and the way they find their expressions through Alvin Hansen's advocacy is the idea that if we really want to tackle this problem of maintaining employment, we must create a balance wheel which can offset the fluctuations in private capital outlays. That what he calls a balance wheel. This is a compensatory fiscal program. And he thinks that, yes, we've reached a point where we can use a flexible tax structure which can operate very effectively as a stabilizing device. So this finds its expression in the Employment Act of 1946. So there is a whole campaign during the 1940s because people are really worried that after the war, we're going to fall back to the times of Great Depression because war expenditures are going to come down. So there is a lot of debate about having a full employment bill, which includes the idea of compensatory spending to make sure that we don't go back to the levels of unemployment in which we were in the 1930s. And this bill is changed throughout the debates in Congress. From Full Employment Act, it becomes the Employment Act. The references to full employment are dropped because they're a little bit too controversial for some people in Congress. And then the idea of compensatory spending is also dropped. But the idea that the federal government has a responsibility to stabilize the economy and to maintain employment is still very much at the heart of this bill. This is the beginning of the bill, which says that it is the continuing policy and responsibility of the federal government to coordinate and utilize all its plans, etc., for the purpose of creating and maintaining conditions under which there will be afforded useful employment for those able, willing, and seeking to work, and to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power. And this is really the act that caps the New Deal and begins this idea that the federal government has a responsibility to stabilize employment, to stabilize production, and to stabilize purchasing power, which some people understand as meaning stabilize prices. This is clarified 30 years later with the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act, where in this act, the idea of full employment is reintroduced, along with a number of other things. Of course, in the 1940s, the Employment Act is opposed by a number of people. So who opposes it? People in Congress who are part of what historians call the old guard. And they're very much libertarians in some ways. But it's interesting to look at the reasons for which they oppose this idea of compensatory spending. And really, there is three reasons. The first one is they say compensatory spending theory is untried. Then they say it will vastly expand federal power. And the third reason is it will destroy freedom itself. So it might seem a little excessive, but if we go back to each of these points, the idea that compensatory spending theory is untried in the 1940s is pretty much true, because the budget balancing or the expenditures during the 1930s and the war expenditure during the 1940s weren't really meant to be compensatory spending. There wasn't this theory behind it. Then the idea that it will vastly expand federal power is also actually pretty prescient, because this idea of stabilization policies, that the government has a responsibility in stabilizing the economy, is a very important source of expansion of federal involvement in the economy. And finally, this idea of destroying freedom itself, this might seem a little excessive, but it has to be replaced in the context of the 1940s, where large public expenditures led to large deficits, which were then monetized and led to inflation. And inflation led the government to impose price and wage controls and rationing. And when they say that freedom is destroyed, they have in mind this idea that rationing and price controls destroy a lot of the economic liberties that we have. And what I think is interesting in this is that for them, it's price stability that's the main concern. This idea that if we have too much deficit, too much compensatory spending, this is going to lead to deficits and inflation, and this is related to price stability, that the stabilization policies, which are meant to reduce the fluctuations of private markets, will lead to more instability in the economy. So there is in some ways this stability trade-off. And I think even Alvin Hansen is pretty much aware of this trade-off in the 1940s. So right after the Employment Act, he publishes this book called Economic Policy and Full Employment. And in it, he explains that he will consider some of the problems of managing a full employment economy, the inflation risks, the difficulties of maintaining equilibrium, and debt management. And when you look at the chapters on inflation, he's very well aware that if you produce too much deficit spending, you run the risk of inflation, and you therefore have this trade-off between stabilizing employment or destabilizing prices. By the end of the 1950s, this has gotten into the minds of economists. And Musgrave, in his book on public finance, he divides the responsibility of the government in these three branches: allocation, distribution, and stabilization. And he calls them the three branches of government. And he explains that the stabilization branch of government, it's meant to stabilize this free economy, because the free economy, if it's uncontrolled, it tends towards more or less drastic fluctuations in price and employment. So public policy must assume a stabilizing function in order to hold within tolerable limits departures from high employment and price stability. It is thus of paramount importance for the success of free economic systems to develop the compensatory measures which can maintain high employment when private economic activity threatens to slacken, and which can maintain price level stability when demand threatens to exceed available supplies. So if we take stock at this point of what I've been talking about, before the 1930s, stability was mainly discussed in relation to price stability. Then comes the Great Depression, and economists ask, are markets stable? Are the markets, the private markets, the free markets stable? Their answers lead them to propose, models that model stability in the framework of dynamic processes, allowing us to reach equilibrium, and then to the idea that we need stabilization policies to ensure full employment. And eventually this leads to a trade-off between employment stability and price stability, which is very well recognized as soon as the 1940s and 1950s. And then it's interesting to look at, what was the record of these stabilization policies? Did they really work to stabilize the economy? Well, in the 80s and 90s, there was a number of articles that were published that tried to look at the empirical record and say, are the economic fluctuations after World War II, are they more stabilized than before, mainly World War I or before the war? And most of this literature shows that actually, no, there isn't that much difference in the business cycle before and after the war. And that all the difference that's viewed sometimes comes just from the way that the NBER was dating recessions and looking at the empirical record. So this is an analysis of recessions since the 1790s. And if you use a more consistent index of production than what the NBER used to date recessions, you can see that there is very little difference between before and after the war. So the problem is why is the record so indecisive? If it is the case that stabilization policies were meant to reduce the business cycle, why is it that we don't see such a reduction? One hypothesis which tracks with this idea is that proposed by William Nordhaus of a political business cycle. Nordhaus says, given both casual and formal evidence of economic behavior and the historical record in the countries examined, it is clear that a political business cycle is a significant factor in the operation of some capitalist democratic economies. And he says in his initial paper, this is especially the case in the United States. And the data he uses to check his model is 1947, 1972, so after the adoption of the Employment Act. So basically saying, now, in addition of the economic business cycle, we have this political business cycle, which may have added some instability in the economy, and which I think is directly related to this idea of stabilization policies, because it gave the authority to the federal government of vastly expanded programs of stabilization policies. Another reason why the record might be so indecisive is that stabilization policies, at least as in the way I try to relate them to you, how they emerged, these stabilization policies, they came from a very particular view of stability, they came from this idea of stability as reaching an equilibrium through a dynamic process. And maybe there is a possibility that this is actually a wrong view of what economic stability is. And this is, I think, an idea that has been defended by a number of people, including Friedrich Hayek, who argued that markets are discovery processes, that competition, perfect competition doesn't capture what really happens in market, because the problem of competition is that when we want to make use of it, it can only be justified by not knowing the essential circumstances that determine the behavior of the competitors. If we knew everything, we wouldn't need markets to allocate resources. We need markets and competition in order to discover what is the best way to allocate resources. And in this way, it's very much harder to talk about equilibrium, because and about stability in the sense that was defended by the early econometricians and macro dynamics. Another economist who defended such an approach is James Buchanan, and in a paper with Victor Van Berg, who's pictured here with him, they defend this idea that the equilibrium concept is associated with a worldview that treats the future as implied in the present, which is pretty much the idea that you find in the early models, like the multiplier accelerator model. Judged against such a benchmark, every act, however imaginative and creative, can be seen as a discovery of something that was already waiting to be found. Now, they say it seems questionable, however, whether the mental construct of such an imagined world is a helpful analytical guide when applied to the study of socioeconomic change. And this is really my parting thought here. It's the idea that, if we have equilibrium, we need to talk about dynamic process, to talk about stability. And a lot of people say, reject this idea of equilibrium. And if they reject this idea of equilibrium, this idea of stability in many ways doesn't really make sense in their framework. And I think that's something to keep in mind when we ask the question, are markets stable? Oftentimes we're implying, that we can say if they're stable or unstable, but it might be that this is actually the wrong question, and that we need to think about markets a little bit differently. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. Okay, great. We have some questions. If you also have some questions, please put it in the box in the Zoom. So the first question is, could you elaborate a little bit about Kalecki's recurring cycles theory, in the sense of what does he aims to explain? Are the waves or the cycles patterns have a pattern, or are they random in his theory?
Well, they're not completely random. They come from the interaction between profits and investment. And we talk a little bit more about this in the book. I'm not the it's too bad you're asking me this question, because it's my co-author who's the specialist of Kalecki and who talks more about this. But what Kalecki tries to do is to set up a model where it's going to be right on the edge between stability and instability, and markets are going to keep fluctuating over and over again.
Second question is related to a discussion about business cycles through different time scales. So what about Kondratiev waves and Kuznets swings or things like that? Are these people kind of interrelated to the debates that you just debated?
Yes, these are initially empirical economists are interested in very much distinguishing different waves, different lengths of waves. And when Frisch sets up his model initially, he looks at these different waves and he says, okay, my model needs to reproduce different cycles which have these different lengths. And when he does that, this is why he sets up his model in the way he does it, because the way he solves his model is by separating the different components that can enter into this cycle. into the aggregate evolution of the economy. So that in this way it is related, but then it becomes a problem of, you know, they really want to explain the aggregate economy, not so much like the different business cycles that can evolve in the economy.
To what extent are the models that you just talked about based on the economy of the US and hence might have to be adjusted when discuss other economies?
I think that's a very interesting question. And I think when you look at data on unemployment, for instance, you look at unemployment in the US, and it kind of looks like Frisch's model. You have shocks, and then the economy slowly goes back to an equilibrium. But if you look at a lot of other countries, it really doesn't look like that at all. Like if you look at France, for instance, unemployment in France, it's really like waves of increasing structural unemployment, and then it goes back down. And you really don't really see, like in the way that you see in the US, these dynamic processes that's at play behind the data, where of shocks and then stable mechanisms going back to equilibrium. And you know, initially, when these people developed these models, a lot of them were Europeans, so they looked at a lot of European data. They estimated them on European data, but then with the war, the depression and the war, a lot of them left the European continent and went to the United States, and then they became involved in the controversies specific to the US. And in this way, the US came the US economy came to play a very predominant role, especially when you look at the debate on, you know, accelerator, multiplier, this type of models. Yeah.
Related to the discussion on the Employment Act and the policies in the United States, when you talk about the opponents to such an act, are these people influenced by any economist, by Hayek, for example, or they follow their convictions, just our ideologies that they have?
Well, yes. Okay, so you have some influence by Hayek. The Road to Serfdom is published in the mid 1940s, but I think they are also influenced by an older tradition. So in the US, you know, the late 19th century, one of the most important economists was William Graham Sumner, and Sumner was pretty much a libertarian economist, you know, in the tradition of Adam Smith and 19th century economist, and I think this is why what we call the old guard was pretty tied to like these libertarian themes, because there was this there were an economic influence that I think has petered out and disappeared during the early 20th century, and I think what they say is not often is portrayed as being just business opposition to compensatory spending. I think it's not just that. I think there is an economic reasoning. There is a reasoning behind the idea of balancing the budget. It's mostly a reasoning about price stability, and of course it overlooks some developments in the US economy where public deficits are less inflationary when there is such a huge demand for government debt. But I think it's too reductionist to just say this was business opposition. I think there was economists behind it, and I think there is not a lot of research about this, and this is actually something that interests me going forward. I'm trying to look at these themes. Yeah.
Great. And there's a question: how would you place Keynes in the discussion? Have you looked into the thinking in your book?
So the book doesn't look into Keynes. The argument of the book is that what was important for macroeconomics wasn't so much Keynes and his ideas, but the idea of setting up models of the macroeconomy, and having these models is really what stayed after the war as one of the most important tools methodologically for economists to talk about the macroeconomy. So in the book, we don't talk a lot about Keynes, although it is true that, you know, once you get to the accelerator multiplier model and compensatory spending, these became tied to Keynesian ideas. But what's important in the US debate is how these ideas were translated by some American economists. So, the idea of the multiplier is proposed by Kahn and then extended a little by Keynes in 31, 33. And then it's taken up by John Morris Clark in the US. And this is really the starting point of the discussion in the US of the accelerator multiplier model. This is not just Keynes and Kahn, this is also Clark. And when you look at the debates around the Employment Act, there is there are very few references to Keynes. And when they talk about compensatory spending, when they try to relate it to economic theories, they relate it both to Keynes, but also to Hansen and to someone like Wallace, who was a very big proponent of these ideas, and some other American economists.
So one final question about the co-web models. I think you kind of already explained through Samuelson, but in such a model, what would cause the cycles? Is this a shock, or is this something inherent instability in the markets that cause to unravel it?
In which model?
The co-web model. The Tinbergen's co-web model?
Oh, the cobweb model.
Yeah.
Well, in the cobweb models, it's just like the relative elasticity of supply and demand. It's not a very discussed process. Yeah.
Okay. So, well, thank you very much, Vincent. It has been a pleasure to have you.
Thanks. It was a pleasure to be here and to talk about this with you.
So let's remind everyone that we will continue next week talking about basically the economic efficiency. So we will continue our journey into the markets. Thank you, everyone. See you next week.
Thanks.